Hi there, and welcome to The Defender, Wisconsin's environmental podcast. I'm Amy Barrilleaux. The Defender is powered by Clean Wisconsin, your environmental voice since 1970. If you are concerned about AI data centers in Wisconsin and water impacts, just don't even worry about it. New closed-loop cooling systems mean it's all good. At least that's what we're hearing from tech companies. But is it true? In this episode, I talk with a Clean Wisconsin researcher who took a deep dive into the water impacts of AI data centers. And what she found is something you're not hearing many tech companies talking about. That's right now on The Defender. In Wisconsin, we are at the center of the largest freshwater system in the world, our Great Lakes. The water here has drawn people to this area for thousands of years, and no surprise, these days it's drawing tech companies to build AI data centers. Plus, we have some pretty sweet data center tax breaks in Wisconsin. But should we be worried about what these enormous facilities will do to our precious water resources? Joining me to talk it all through is Clean Wisconsin Water Policy Manager Hannah Richerson. Hannah, thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I want to start just by talking about water because I think when it comes to AI data centers, there are all kinds of concerns. There's cost, there's how much electricity they use, there's the use of fossil fuels to meet these needs, pushing us further from our climate goals, land use. I mean, this is like a long list. But when you look at some polling, water concerns are like always at the top of the list. Why do you think that is? Why are people, I guess, so worried about what happens to our water because of AI data centers?
Yeah, I think that folks are rightfully concerned about the water resources because water is such a precious resource. And despite Wisconsin being a relatively water-rich state, I think it's a good sign that folks are still engaging with water use concerns because it shows an indication that they understand that water is needed for everything, for drinking water, for wildlife, for recreation. It shows, an understanding and a care for that.
You mentioned that Wisconsin is kind of a water-rich state. So should we care, I guess, if an AI data center comes in and uses a whole bunch of water? Should that really be a concern when we're sitting here on two huge Great Lakes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think it matters. I do think that we should, at least take time to engage with this and determine if there is an issue. I guess I'll take a step back and talk about how water use in this context falls into two categories, so direct and indirect. And direct water refers to water withdrawn and consumed on-site at data centers for cooling and other operational needs. And then indirect use refers to water withdrawn and consumed off-site at power plants to generate the electricity that powers data centers. And I think that while the direct water use is an important consideration, I think there's a major blind spot with regard to indirect water use, because the majority of water used to support data centers, over 70%, stems from indirect use. And power plants use a lot of water.
So I think, you're touching on what folks could call like the energy water nexus, which is, that power plants need a ton of water, coal plants, gas plants, nuclear power plants especially. So when we think about AI and the data centers that power AI, I think a lot has been said about how much energy they use. I mean, we're talking about one data center can use as much energy or more than the city of Milwaukee. So a lot of energy for each data center. So you took a look at, okay, some of the approved data centers that are being built or just about done in Wisconsin, and looked at that kind of bigger footprint, not just what's going to be used on site, but what's going to be used in total to serve this data center. What did you find out?
So I think I want to start by explaining that power generation in Wisconsin, electric power generation in Wisconsin is by far the largest water using sector in the state. So it consistently withdraws around 73% or 1.2 trillion gallons of our total water withdrawals each year. And just from the top 10 power plants that used the most water, we lost 9.7 million gallons of water to evaporation from those facilities in 2024. So when we look at how hyperscale data center development could impact those, it was difficult to try quantifying those indirect water use of specific data centers without knowing the data center's actual consumption rates of power and without more details about the supporting power plant, such as the type of fuel and cooling system used. But in the absence of that information, we can make some assumptions and estimate water demands. So we know that Vantage Data Center's first phase of development in Port Washington is expected to use 1.3 gigawatts of power, and full build-out has anticipated power needs closer to 3.5 gigawatts. And although we lack data on hourly or seasonal energy use, we can estimate daily power demands by assuming the facility will operate consistently at full capacity. And depending on the type of fuel used to generate electricity and the cooling system implemented, we can estimate how much indirect water withdrawal and consumption could be needed to support that particular data center. Water withdrawal is the amount of water removed from the ground or diverted from a water source, and water consumption is the amount of water used that is lost, predominantly through evaporation. So just looking at the Port Washington data center, the average water withdrawal amounts during the first phase could range from 20.2 million gallons per day if accepting power from a natural gas power plant using a tower cooling system, to 1.3 billion gallons per day if accepting power from a nuclear power plant using once-through cooling system.
So I just want to stop you there because it's hard, it's a lot of numbers and they all sound pretty big. And so there are so many variables, so that's why we have such a big range. But even at the small range, I think it was about 20 million gallons of water a day. That's the city of Green Bay uses that much water a day. So on the low range, if this is powered by power plants, which it appears is likely, we're talking about a city's worth, a major city in Wisconsin worth of water that's going to be withdrawn each day. And if it could be much, much higher. So when you came across these numbers, and that came across, I would say worked really hard to get these numbers, did you start thinking, oh, this is a big deal, or what went through your mind?
Yeah, to put that in perspective a little bit, most Wisconsinites withdraw approximately 56 gallons of water per day. So this one data center's indirect water withdrawals could equal, the amount withdrawn by between 975,000 and 66.5 million people each day at full build out. I think that it's just important, something that I've heard from it in conversations is, well, other water using industries are using comparable amounts of water, so we shouldn't be concerned. And I guess my response to that is, but that's not accounting for the cumulative impacts of all of these. So it's power plants, it's the data centers themselves using water, and municipalities using water for drinking water, and all of the other water using sectors that we have in the state. And there hasn't been, to my knowledge, a comprehensive analysis of the cumulative impacts of all of those together, including the increased demand that we're going to see from data centers.
So yeah, you mentioned earlier that power plants, or power production, I should say, is responsible for 70% of the water withdrawals in the state. And we're in a state that needs a lot of water, like for farming, for example. But still, the water withdrawals from power plants, from electric production, far outweigh what we use for irrigation in the state. Are you surprised in a state like Wisconsin, where we have so much farming, especially, that still far and away electric production is the biggest water withdrawal sector in the state?
Yeah, I think I was initially surprised until I didn't understand how much water electric power plants used either, until I started digging into the numbers and understanding how they're using water, the cooling systems that they're using, things like that. So I think that, at least for me, it wasn't common knowledge. So it doesn't surprise me that folks are also surprised to learn that a significant amount, 73% of our water withdrawals in the state are from electric power.
So we have this, historic, I think, increase coming in terms of electricity production in Wisconsin just to meet the needs of the data centers that have been approved so far. When you try to, I guess, explain all this to people, like, okay, we have this many power plants and, this increase in power needs, and that affects the water and the number of water withdrawals, and this is the total footprint. It starts to get kind of complicated. Do people really understand what you're saying typically, or how hard is it to get this information out?
I think that folks are receptive to the information, and this is new for everybody. This is new for the public. This is new for researchers. This is new for policy folks. It's new to everybody. And so I think just as it took, again, all of those groups, the researchers, the policy folks, and the communities, it's just taken us time to get up to speed on what all of this actually means. But I do think that folks are receptive to the information and are starting to understand the fuller picture of all of this. I do still see a focus on direct on-site water use and less of a focus on indirect off-site water use when we're speaking of water use concerns. And for me, I think that there needs to be more of a focus on the indirect off-site. Again, because we've talked about how much the power plants, how much water the power plants need. So I think that is just the gap that I think I see when I'm engaging with folks.
What I'm seeing when I hear tech companies talking about their AI data centers is this focus on on-site water use, because they've got these closed loop systems now, and they're like, we're going to use hardly any water, so don't even worry about that. And they try to get people's focus on the site itself. Do you think that's, I guess, painting an incomplete picture of the water use of their data centers?
Yes, I think that there are a lot more nuances here that folks might not be aware of. And part of the confusion comes from the definition of closed loop cooling system, or the lack of a definition. Closed loop can mean several different things. It can mean that a cooling system recirculates a fluid like water or glycol and does not, or doesn't often, replace the recirculating fluid. It can also mean that the liquid in one of the heat transferring loops does not come into contact with other substances, like another fluid or the air. And another layer of confusion is that there are many, many different cooling system configurations. That is, industrial cooling systems, like the ones needed in hyperscale data centers, can use a combination of different types of cooling methods, some of which may conserve water and others that may not. So that's why just hearing that a proposed hyperscale data center will use a closed loop cooling system to address water use concerns still doesn't give me the information I need to fully assess the potential environmental impacts. But all that said, closed loop cooling systems do use less water than other types of cooling systems. But heat still needs to be transferred away from the fluid in the closed loop so the fluid can be cooled for recirculation. And to do that, heat is moved through a heat exchanger, similar to a radiator in a vehicle, and large electric fans move the heat into the environment. Thus, the trade-off to less direct on-site water use is more indirect off-site energy use. And as we've discussed, power plants require immense amounts of water. So for me, the consumption calculation is the same either way. At some point, whether we're using water directly on the data center campuses or we're indirectly pushing the water use downstream to the power plant, a lot of water is needed.
It almost feels like it's from the tech companies, hey, look over here, don't look over there. Like, look at what we're using or what we're not using on our site. Let's not talk about power. And in fact, that's one of the things that we don't get to know when a plant is proposed or a data center is proposed is, well, how much electricity are you going to use? And how is that electricity going to get produced for you? How important is it for us to really be aware of those things before a data center gets approved?
I think incredibly important. We talked a little bit about these kind of general calculations that I was able to do, but I was able to do those calculations again, just looking at very general average information. We need to know, the rates of power that a data center is planning to use. We need to know what type of power the data center is going to need. Is it going to be coal? Is it going to be natural gas? Is it going to be nuclear? We need that type of information to be able to accurately assess the environmental implications of the data center. So having that information is essential to being able to make informed decisions about whether these are good or not in our communities.
I want to get back to those closed loop systems for a little bit. They're like the mystery loops. There's so little information about how they work. We do know that there are chemicals involved. And I haven't seen really any tech company say, oh, these are the chemicals that are going to be used. This is how we are going to dispose of them. This is how often we dispose of them. This is whether or not there are any chemical vapors on site. How is it that we have so little knowledge? I mean, I know you've tried to look into some of these things. What are the kinds of pieces of information you've been able to kind of piece together?
Yeah, I do think that is some of the important data that we're missing. While we don't have specific information to each proposed data center's closed loop cooling system or closed loop system or cooling system design, any fluid that's recirculated is going to need some sort of additive in it. So I think it's safe to assume we can expect to see antimicrobial additives, anti-corrosion additives, and things like that.
Yeah, and there's those are such general categories, anti-corrosion, especially. There's so many different types of chemicals that could be. And then for the public to not even know what they are and how they're going to be disposed of should raise some red flags. Why are we not seeing, I mean, you're not going to have an answer to this, but I'll just ask you anyway. Why are we not seeing any government agency or body saying, we need to know exactly how you're going to handle these chemicals and what are they? So answer that question that you can't answer.
We're not seeing that. And I think that, the simple answer to that is because they're not required to provide it. So without, a regulatory requirement that says you need to provide details about what you are releasing, I don't think folks, it's not something that we see voluntarily done.
It feels like the kind of through thread in our conversation is these things are moving faster than information, and they're moving faster than any kind of laws or requirements. So we're kind of in the dark. Like we have data centers, AI data centers, they're about to be done and brought online for all intents and purposes, and we still don't have really most of this information. How concerning is that?
I think it's a huge gap in information. We have let these hyperscale data centers come into our state with almost zero regulatory oversight when it comes to a facility of this size. It's unprecedented. And again, we don't have the information that we need to be able to assess what that even means. I think another part of this is we have no idea what this is going to look like as it plays out.
When you sat down to figure out, okay, what's the water footprint of these facilities going to be? How daunting was it when you really started digging into this with this whole lack of information?
It was very difficult. Again, I had to look back at research papers that just generally assessed power plants, that just generally assessed types of cooling systems, and make a lot of assumptions that way.
I forgot to ask you this in the beginning of our conversation, but your career is all about researching water and water impacts, whether it's chemicals in water like PFAS or it's the ability to get water where it's needed, all of these things. Water touches every part of our lives. What made you start thinking, okay, I want to do something water related. I want to be a water researcher?
Yeah, I think ever since I was little, I knew that the natural environment was very special to me. And it was something that in some form or another, I wanted to work to protect. And as I progressed through college and graduate school and eventually law school, I really had a tie to water. Water is precious. It is life. We all need it. Humans, other than human animals and plants. And it is just such an important thing that I knew that I wanted to find a position in which I could do the most good for our water resources. And I have found that that is at the intersection of science and law, where I can really look at the scientific implications of how we use our water. And I can also, on the legal side of things and the policy side of things, by being a lot better at being able to propose potential solutions to how we could use our water resources better.
So what's the next step in your mind? I mean, we talked about all the black holes of information. If you could talk to lawmakers or city council folks or whoever are the powers that be in Wisconsin that could work on some transparency, where would you start?
I think I would say we just need more oversight of these proposed and approved data centers. We've talked a lot about not having access to data, and it's hard to make informed decisions without that data. So requirements for transparency about on and off-site energy and water use, that's important. Conducting site-specific environmental siting assessments prior to development to make sure that we are developing in an area that can support this amount of water use. And then I think what I would love to see are binding commitments, so not promises or pledges, to ongoing energy and water use reporting, on-site energy and water efficiency practices, meeting electricity demands with new renewable energy and other carbon-free electricity sources, and using sustainable energy storage over diesel or gas generation for backup power. So I guess I would say just more oversight in general is needed.
You mentioned renewable resources as power sources for these big data centers. It's important to note that wind and solar use zero water when they produce electricity.
Correct.
So sometimes we forget to say that because we're so busy talking about all the gas plants that are being built to serve these AI data centers, but that's an important thing to note. I think sometimes when people hear, oh, we should power this gigantic AI data center with wind and solar and battery storage, they think, well, that's not possible. In fact, we hear it from our energy utilities. Well, we can't possibly do that. We need a gas plant, or we need to keep this coal plant online, as we're seeing We Energies is doing. But you've got examples of that, it is possible.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing these hyperscale data center tech companies and developers doing it in other states. Meta's Eagle Mountain data center in Utah is fully powered by 800 megawatts of on and off-site solar. The Switch Citadel campus in Nevada is powered exclusively by 650 megawatts of solar. Meta's Mesa data center in Arizona is supported by a 300 megawatt battery energy storage system. And Google is partnering with Xcel Energy in Minnesota to develop a 300 megawatt battery system for one of its hyperscale data centers.
So maybe it's not that it's not possible, it's just there has to be a little bit more oomph from state lawmakers and regulators and everybody else to kind of demand it.
Correct. Like we talked about, these aren't the types of decisions that folks are doing voluntarily.
Well, Hannah, thank you so much for your really important work on this. I think Clean Wisconsin is the first organization to really, in Wisconsin, dig into that off-site water use, that big footprint that these AI data centers are carrying. So I appreciate you doing that work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for listening to The Defender. I've got a link to Hannah's research and a lot of other resources in the show notes. or you can head to cleanwisconsin.org/podcast. I'm Amy Barrilleaux. Talk to you later.